Well, y'all, welcome to the Springs. If I've not had the chance to meet you, my name's John Almquist. I'm the pastor here at the Springs. And if it's your first time with us, as Todd shared, we are so glad you're here. We know as folks come to church throughout this, everyone's always coming at times for a different reason. Some of you, it's your first time back in a long time. Some of you, you have been walking with Christ for decades. Wherever you are in that spectrum, we're glad you're here. We're glad you're here. If you've been tracking with us, what you know is right now we're working our way through the book of Ephesians. All that is, that's a letter in the New Testament portion of a Bible. We've been looking at kind of two general themes: who Christ has made us to be and what he's called us to do. Today, we're going to continue looking at, hey, what are some of the things he's called us to do as regards to relationships? But before we do that, I just want to start with a quick question. I left mine back there in case I got a phone call. Who here owns an iPhone? Raise your hand. Come on. Look at you, Samsung people holding out. Bless y'all, right? Here's another question. How many of you owned the first iPhone? All right, obviously a little less. Well, hey, Apple products, if you're like me, I've really enjoyed Apple products over last decade, 2 decades and a half there, whatever that timeline's been. Here's the reason I start by talking about Apple. That's a product where Steve Jobs, if you're not a big fan of Steve Jobs, I bet you still know who he is, the founder and then the real leader, especially in Apple, they came back in a rebound right at the early 2000s. He had a leadership philosophy. He had a design philosophy that really put Apple in the forefront of a lot of products. And if you disagree with that and you'd say, hey, their quality's gone down recently, I agree with you. We can all send Tim Cook a letter, right? But here's what I tell you. He had a design philosophy that changed Apple. He had a design philosophy that changed the way a lot of us think about products. Do you guys, if you own an iPhone, do you ever remember getting the first one? And it came in a box. And the box was in and of itself beautiful. Now, if you own Samsung, you have no idea what I'm talking about, but it's a nice box, right? It was a pretty box. And I can remember thinking, oh my gosh, they put so much time, attention, and effort into the box. Not only the phone in and of itself, to call it art, hey, that's too far. I'm just not that emotionally creative. But some people, sure, design elements of it. They made something functional be beautiful in form. One of the things I know myself, I like doing, as well as many others, I like thinking through, I like learning. Hey, why do people who are great in areas excel in greatness? Here's my best idea for why I think Steve Jobs, he changed a design philosophy. If you didn't know this, Steve Jobs, he was adopted. He was adopted by parents in California. His adoptive father was named Paul. Paul, he didn't have a college degree, but what he did know is he was he was an excellent mechanic. For most of his life, he rebuilt engines while Steve was there, rebuilt engines. And the other things he'd do is he was a repo man. So he'd repossess products, all that kind of stuff. But he was one of those guys, I am not one of these guys, tremendously handy. If something broke, he could just fix it. And he tried to instill that same work ethic, that same product quality, that same design element to Steve. There's a biography of Steve Jobs written by Walter Isaacson. If you don't want to read it, don't worry about it. Pretty interesting, though. The part where it really starts out, that I never forgot this, and I read this years ago. I can remember Steve, he described 2 moments in his childhood. The first was an actual event, and then it was an idea with his dad. His dad had asked him, hey, Steve, will you come help me? We got to build a fence for the backyard. And Steve goes, he literally talks about handing them a hammer, they go out to do it. And the first thing Paul does, Steve's adopted dad, is he begins to share. Hey, a lot of times when people go to fence, here's what they do. The inside part, the part that everyone can see besides the neighbors, the inside part, that gets the time, the attention, the detail, the nice wood, the finishing, the clean nails that go all the way in, the screw that sets perfectly. And then on the backside is what will get the scrap wood. The backside is oftentimes what never gets finished. Why? Because not as many people see it. But you know who knows it and you know who sees it? The one who built the fence. And he instilled in Steve, hey, you build the back of the fence just as well as you build the front. Why? Because it's excellent. And 2, the phrase he used is the product quality must run throughout. There was a way that Steve described his dad. He said, hey, if my dad were going to go to build a cabinet, now just imagine there's just one cabinet, right? If he were to build a cabinet, a lot of times folks, they'll go, I've never done this, I wish I knew how to, right? But they'd buy the cabinet, and there's 2 or 3, generally outward facing sides of the cabinet, what people could see. Those three sides, hey, they'd finish it with nice wood, cherry oak, a nice stain. They'd sand it down. And then Steve said what his dad instilled in him is the knowledge, hey, a lot of folks, the back side of the cabinet, the part that nobody would ever see except the maker would know. He said the back side of the cabinet, don't buy plywood. Buy just as nice of a piece of wood. And you finish it, why? Product quality throughout. Here's why I share that. Paul Jobs, man who built engines, and he must have been the type of guy where if your engine went down or if something's wrong with your car mechanically, he was the guy you wanted fixing it. Why? Because he knew the value of work was both in its pursuit of excellence as well as the care of the one working on it. You know who took that? Steve Jobs. Like there's almost stories, and Steve Jobs is a leader in his management staff. You know anything about him? I'm not a proponent of everything. But what I'm telling you is he had a value of excellence. And he had a value of workmanship for the sake of work. What a lot of people don't know is Steve's adopted dad, Paul. They raised him Lutheran. He attended a Lutheran church there in Northern California for a long time. They, within the Lutheran denomination, they chose to even have Steve baptized as an infant. Steve attended Sunday school for years. He eventually came to a place, though, where he could not get over the question, if God is good, why is there evil? Now, if you wrestle with that question, let us know after. But that's generally what led Steve down then a path of what he would describe as a lot of Buddhism. Here's why I set that up, though. His dad, faith background, instilled in him a pursuit of excellence in his craft and the heart to know. The one that knows whether the backside is plywood, whether the backside of the fence is done just as well, is you. So do good work for good work's sake. Now, what you never know is, hey, did Paul Jobs, did he get that from a text that we're going to look at today? And what I'm telling you is, I think he did. I can't say that definitively. I can't prove that. I don't know Paul. If you guys do, I'd love to call him and ask him, right? But here's why I share this story. Today, here's what we're going to look at. The Apostle Paul, he's going to talk to you, and he's going to talk to me. And what he's going to say is Christian. So if you're here and you're a follower of Jesus Christ, your work, your vocation, metaphorically, you are called to not only create a beautiful cabinet on three sides, but the back wall, you're meant to finish it through. Why? It's excellent in its action, and it's honoring to God in your attitude. So today, we're going to talk about work. We are going to talk about, hey, what does it look like? Should Christians give into case of the Mondays? Anybody when Monday comes, they're like, oh man, back to work. Anybody get that? Yeah, I don't. That's funny. I'm a preacher. See you guys. Come on, I'm gonna instruct you guys in what's funny and what's not, right? But that's one of those, right? Is that a good Christian heart, or is that something we should change? Because here's why I think this matters so much. And this is true if you're in this room and you're wrestling with faith, if you're a believer in Christ, or if you're not, right? Even from research, like this past week, spent a lot of time looking into this. There's a gal, JT O'Donnell. She's the CEO of Work It Daily. What she does is research studies on workplace satisfaction as well as workplace placement, finding jobs and getting connected. She said 70% of workers, according to her research, don't feel satisfied in their job. So out of this room, 7 in 10 people do not feel satisfied, connected with their work, right? You might be able to describe it another way. Look forward to, enjoy, have a peace in. 70% of folks. She says there's generally 3 reasons why this happens, 3 reasons. The first one is, she says, a lot of it is done by the way people respond to this question. So let me ask you this. If I were to come and spend time with you and I were to ask you, so what do you do? What do you do? Or what do you do for work? She said for most people, that question worries them. She didn't go so far as to say terrify, but concerns them. Why? Because we feel this desire for our response to that question to be impressive. One of the number one reasons why people do not find contentment, satisfaction, peace in work is they feel like, hey, what I do is not impressive enough, born out of a desire to impress. The second reason a lot of people don't find contentment in work is around the idea of external benefits. This could be literal, like healthcare, dental, benefits, all that kind of stuff, income, perks, time off, all those different things. And so what we do is to try to find the satisfaction internally. We reach for the external and try to fill what is lacking. Now, if you're a follower of Christ, you already know that never works, right? So the first reason we're not content, according to J.T. O'Donnell, is desire to impress. The second reason that we're not content, we're not satisfied, it's a desire for more. And the third, this is where she sets it up. A lot of folks in their job, what a job inherently does, is it stretches them beyond their comfort zone. They're asked to do things when they're not inherently good at it. They're asked to do things that they haven't done in the past. And what does that do? That puts us in an uncomfortable position where two things can occur. Maybe we don't do as well as what we want people to think of us, as well as discomfort's just uncomfortable. But here's what I'm telling you. The text we're going to look at today, it's going to say this. You're called to find contentment regardless of a desire to impress. No vocation gives you the satisfaction. You spend time with rich people, you spend time with people leading Fortune 500 companies. They'll be the first ones to tell you that. Right? The desire for more and intrinsic, it won't help you sleep at night. And then finally, right? We, especially as Christians, man, we're drawn out of our comfort zone. What is discomfort? Support? What does it help? What does it fuel? Dependence. And man, we are called to be a dependent people. I've heard it said many, many times, right? If dependence is the goal, which if you're a follower of Christ, it is for you. If dependence is the goal, weakness is an advantage. And what can work create? An environment where you say, Lord, I need some help. And then you go Google how to solve it for like the next 30 minutes. Okay, nobody else Googles? Anybody? All right. Well, here, the reason I set that up is I really do believe for the Christ follower as well as for the non-believer, this text, it's vital. As Christians, our work product is a reflection of God. As non-believers, your work product is a reflection of you. And here's what I'm hoping you see. Following these biblical principles, it will bless the work product you do. But far more than that, I hope you see there's one worth following to where you really can find peace, even in the midst of a difficult workplace. The text we're going to be looking at, it's Ephesians chapter 6. We're just going to look at 4 verses. Chapter 6, we're going to look at verses 5 through 9. We're going to break it out into 2 ideas. All right? We're going to set it up and we're going to look at employees and what is our role as subordinates, as employees in the workplace. And then we'll look at employers. What is our role as people who are in leadership over others, ownership in companies, position as partners? We're one rung up on the ladder, whatever that would be. And for both, we're going to break down this idea. Both our actions, what we do, how we do it, as well as our attitudes. Both our actions as well as our attitudes matter to God. To set this up, the book of Ephesians, the first 3 chapters, it's God writing through this church leader named Paul. And he's writing to Christians and he's saying, because of your faith in Jesus Christ, God views you as lovely, as treasured, as a child of his, as an heir. He's crazy about you. How faith changes you. And the next 3 chapters, it says, hey, in response to the love from God, here is how you are to love a world that often doesn't know him, doesn't trust him, doesn't believe in him. So it's who he's made you to be, and it's how you are to live. The past couple weeks, we've been specifically looking at relationships. How as Christians, we're called to be filled with the Spirit. And when we're filled with the Spirit, we live in subject to one another and reverence. First type of relationships that we looked at was marriage, husband and wife. The past 2 weeks, we look at parents and children. And this week, we're going to look at employees and employers. That's where we are. What I want to do, let's just show the text real quick. Ephesians 6, let's look at verses 5 through 9. I'm going to reference something, but today, right at the start, we're going to jump into the text, but we got to get over one obstacle. There's one obstacle right at the beginning we got to cover. You see the first word there? Bondservants. Let's keep going. Obey your earthly masters. That bondservant there, that's a translation of a Greek word, doulos, slave. What Paul's writing to is he's saying slaves and masters. Anytime you come to a text in your Bible, there's always layers. Here's what I mean by that. The Bible, it's an inexhaustible resource. You can go before that and constantly be learning and learning and learning. But with all text, there's a primary takeaway, but then there's secondary, there's third, and you can keep going down, right? One of the things in particular because of the culture and the history of slavery in America, that as we go to examine this text, it's not the primary instruction to it, but what we have to cover is the idea of, hey, what's the Bible's response to slavery? I saw 12 years a slave, right? Was God for that? Was God for the man stealing that took place in Africa, the throwing on of ships in terrible conditions, enslavement to the bottom of it over 3 months, sailing across the sea where most people became sick, infected, died, and were thrown overboard, and then brought him in here? Does God say to them, submit? If no one's ever asked you that question, as you continue to grow in faith and you engage with people, they will. Here's what I want to do. I want to take 5 minutes, and I want to respond to that. Absolutely not. Christianity as a faith, Jesus Christ, God himself, has never been. There's no one, no being, no faith, no reference that is more for the oppressed than him. The downtrodden, those victimized, the weak, the impoverished, the emotionally, the monetarily, and the physically poor. That's who Christ came for. That is who he came for. Here's the reason I set that up, though. As we look at this text, here's something you must need to know. The Bible, it never condemns the institution of slavery. It never condemns the institution of slavery, but it condemns every form of oppression. It doesn't condemn slavery, but it absolutely condemns oppression. So stay with me while we break that down. Oppression everywhere in form of any type of superiority to inferiority. I make more, I look different, my race is different, my intellect is different. Any time man elevates him over others, God says, hey, I oppose the proud. I give grace to the weak. So the first thing, he didn't come to condemn slavery, and I'll explain it more, but he did come to condemn oppression. And what is the root of that? Slavery. One of the things you got to see, first century Rome, slavery was different than the way a lot of times we grew up thinking about slavery. There were similarities, and I'll explain that, but it also was different. A slave in this time, you could be a physician, you could be an attorney, you could be an accountant. You could work yourself to freedom. Under Old Testament law, there was a year of Jubilee that consistently occurred where all slaves were free. God put laws in place to protect the rights of people who were once only viewed as subhuman and property. God has always been for the oppressed. But a slave at this time, it was different. You could choose to put yourself in slavery as a form of employment, payment in support of family, and all the different things that could take place there. But with that also, first century Rome, it's true. Slaves were treated terribly at times, absolutely terrible. They were viewed legally as property. You could put them to death. And there was an absolute form of oppression. It's estimated at this time 1/3 of the Roman Empire was slaves. 1/3. Here's why I set that up. There was evil, but it's not the African slave trade that so many of us think about. Still evil, right? And so Paul, as he writes this letters, as he instructs employees and employers, it was a revolutionary kind of love he was talking about. It was a revolutionary kind of love. That's why this is the key. Jesus Christ in the first century, he didn't come to lead a political movement. He's far greater than that. He did not come primarily for the abolition of slavery. He came for the abolition of sin. He came to die for every slave owner and slave, for the wickedness in their heart, to set them free, to where through faith in him they'd view themselves as equal, co-heirs, worthy of dignity, made in his image. So he didn't just come after the symptom, y'all. He severed the root. Here's why that matters. His followers, his faithful people, I'm not saying all Christians have gotten this right throughout history. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying God's men and God's women have faithfully known this truth and pursued this truth throughout history. This is just fun to me right here. About 300 AD, we're just going to keep going, 2 more minutes. 300 AD, Emperor Constantine. He was head of the emperor of Rome. He becomes a Christian. One of the beginning things he does is he changes the law to where you can no longer put a slave to death. He changed the law. You can no longer brand a slave on their face. Why? They were made in the same image. St. Augustine or Augustine, however you'd want to classify him, right? He said this: the primary cause of slavery, sin, the root of the evil. What did Christ come for? Not for the symptom. He came to pull it up by the root. You keep going on. William Wilberforce, the man who led the famous British abolition of the slave trade. You guys know the song Amazing Grace, right? You guys know John Newton, if you don't know. He was a former slave owner. He owned ships and he took slaves. And his response, and that song is Amazing Grace, his response to, I was once wicked, and God still loved me. And what did he do? He helped fight for the freedom of men and women. It continues on. Charles Spurgeon, if you don't know him, he was a famous preacher and pastor. He was so outspoken about slavery and so many of these things, calling it evil. Like when his pamphlets would get to America, there were certain Americans, they'd burn them. He didn't care. John Wesley, the leader of the denomination right now, currently we would call Methodist. If you're here, I grew up Methodist, right? He called slavery the sum of all villainies. The Underground Railroad. You know who led that? Christians. Long before the Emancipation Proclamation. Why? Because God came for all, and he loves all. So as you read master-slave language, what I'm asking you to do now, we're going to set that theme aside, and we're going to move on, because really in our context, what does this most specifically apply to? Employer, employee. Employer, employee. Currently today, it's estimated there's still 27 million slaves. 27 million. Am I saying there are other cultures and contexts where this text won't directly more preach to? Nope. But I'm saying New Braunfels, employer, employee. Finding yourself out of reverence to God, respecting authority. Can y'all track with that? Can we turn that corner? Yeah, okay. All right, we're turning that corner. So here's where we go. We're going to read the text. We're going to stop right there at the end of verse 8, and then we're going to come and talk through it. That's where we're headed. So let's look now, chapter 6, verses 5 through 9. I'm going to go 8. Bondservants, employees, obey your earthly masters, employers, with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart, as you would Christ, doing the will of God from the heart. Oh, lost my place. With a sincere heart, as you would Christ, not by way of eye service, as people pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, rendering service with a good will as to the Lord and not to man, knowing that whatever good anyone does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether he is a bondservant or he is free. My first point out of this text, as employees, both our actions and our attitudes matter. As employees, if you currently find yourself in employment anywhere, both our actions and our attitudes matter. This speaks to, it does not matter if you own the company, right? This speaks to, it does not matter if you're mid-level management, if you're at the bottom, if you own a family business, or if you oversee a family. Actions and attitudes matter to God. As we look at the word action, there's two words specifically I want to pull out here. And if you want to get ready, we're going to jump to Colossians 3 real quick. We're going to look at two separate texts out of this passage. There's this idea within this text, rendering rendering service, a production value. And what is that value to be described as? Right below, it says, anyone who does good, he will receive it back. Let me ask you, in your work environment, whatever it is that you do, is good enough your standard? Is good enough your standard? Right? If you're confused about that, let's look at Colossians 3. We're just going to look at 23 and 24. If you were here last week, you learned with us Colossians in many ways. It's a miniaturized version of Ephesians. Many of the same principles. At times he expounds it a little differently. Same author. He says right here, verse 23, whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord, not for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the inheritance as your reward. You are serving the Lord Christ. I love that. Two keys. Whatever you do is you render good service. Whatever you do. Physician, accountant, right? Military personnel, a teacher, a stay-at-home mom, a student in class, not yet through high school, a college student, now a young professional growing in finance. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Whatever you do, that is what you're called to. Do with an attitude and an action in pursuit of excellence. The second thing is, whatever you do, work heartily is what that text said. Work hard, striving towards. The key theme there, again, is excellence. Now, we as Americans, we must think about excellence not in pursuit of look at what others think about me, but rather, hey, as I go to put my hand to the task, I'm doing this to honor God. A phrase has helped me for years. Excellence, it honors God, and it inspires men. You ever see somebody who's really good at their craft, really good at their trade? See also Apple at the beginning. There's something in that where we're drawn to the excellence. I can remember when I first came out of college. I'll tell this story in two parts. I first came out of college. I worked for a management consulting firm. All that means is I would go and do the data and the presentation stuff for small teams, as those small teams would try to fix big company problems. That was it. So I would go, and I can remember there were 2 ways after I became a Christian I really started thinking about this. I spent a lot of my time in 2 places. A Microsoft Office program called Excel. A Microsoft Office program called PowerPoint. And I can remember the realization and thinking through, my job right now is under the circumstances to the best of my ability to make excellent Excel spreadsheets and PowerPoint presentations. Yeah. And man, I can remember all that to say. That was part of it. So here's what I would say. If you're a teacher, your lesson plan, he's calling you to work heartily, to render good service. If you're in construction, he's asking you to not cheap out on every cost and build houses for others the way you wouldn't build it for yourself. Right? If you're a physician, the care you give to other people, the same care you'd give to your children. Right? If you go and you're an engineer and you build bridges, build the best bridges. Whatever it would be, rendering good service. That's the action we're called to. Now the attitude, this is really what he gets after. There's an amazing thing in the economy of God. God knows if he wants to capture the person, what does he go after? He doesn't try to change the outward. He doesn't try to change the external. He goes after the heart. Because if you change the motivations, you change the actions. That's why we as Christians, we are so emphatic about the idea God loves you. All you got to do is believe. Because so many of us think, no, it's believing plus behaving equals a relationship with God. It's not. It's just believing. And out of that motive, what does that produce? What does that create? A changed life. And that's what God does here. Look at the way he describes the attitude of employees. So we're going to keep looking through that same text. First thing he says, they're called to be marked by fear. Fear. What do you think fear means? We need to do a lesson on this summer. Fear, right here, here's the best way to describe it. Reverence and respect. Do you respect the people who are in authority over you? Do you respect the people who are your boss? Like the next thing it goes to is talks about the idea of trembling. Trembling isn't this idea of, hey, I step out of line and they're going to hit me. It's the idea of, hey, I want to do this well because I don't want to make mistakes. Think it's paying attention to detail. Like, is good enough for you? I'm not saying there aren't days where under the circumstances, good enough is a win. But I'm saying if that's the consistency of the way Christians produce work, we have an opportunity to excel still more. The next way it describes the attitude is sincere heart. Is there any hypocrisy? Is there any duplicity in you? Like, do you talk about your boss one way to his or her face and talk another behind their back? Like to your peers, do you talk about the boss in one way and then you walk in the office and all of a sudden, boom, time to put on the show? That's not what he's calling you to. There's a sincerity. Oh, and here's the amazing part. He even describes it this way. As you would Christ. I by no means, and we'll talk this in a second, think every form of authority is a good form of authority. There really can be oppressive leaders, oppressive bosses. But But here's what you must know. Every position of authority, it's a shadow of a greater authority for you, Christian. Like God in his sovereignty appoints people. And he might even have you be appointed under unhealthy leadership. Why? Because it's actually submission to him, not to them. This really can hurt people, especially in their careers. So if you're starting out your career, you probably get this, or you need to learn this, I should say. Turn with me. You don't have to turn. I'm going to put it here. 1 Peter 2. 1 Peter 2, verses 18 and 19. Servants, be subject to your own masters with all respect. Hear this, church. Not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust. For this is a gracious thing when mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. Y'all hear that? It's a gracious thing when you endure a bad boss. Am I calling you to stay there forever? Nope. But man, I'm calling you to that. For what credit is it if when you sin and are beaten for it, you endure? If when it's your fault and you're corrected, that's your fault. But if when you do good, you suffer for it, you endure, this is a gracious thing in the sight of God. Now hear this. If you're a follower of Christ, for to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you might follow in his steps. Am I saying you can never leave a toxic work environment? No. But I'm saying, do you need to honestly think through whether or not God has called you to that toxic environment for this time? Yes. Your submission is to Christ. Let's keep going. The fifth attitude back there in Ephesians for employees is not by way of eye service. Like, do you change when your boss is watching you? Like, do you wait to leave until they've already left because you're trying to set the impression? Do you come early because you know that they're there watching you to come in? Or is it, hey, I'm going to come and faithfully do my work with excellence and integrity? I'll leave when I leave, and I'll come when I come. Or is it driven by, my favorite, the boss goes out of town? Right? Is that essentially, oh man, it's kind of like a week off? Is it that way? Or is it, hey, I'm not working for them, I'm working for him? Not by way of eye service, not as people pleasers. Man, do you in a job, do you do it for the attaboy? Do you do it for the, hey, the love you, keep going, this is it? Is that what motivates you? Or is it with a pure motive? Are you there to honor God in your craft? And then finally, goodwill. I love that, goodwill. Why? Because it's a catch-all term. He says, do you care about the welfare of your boss and the welfare of your employer? Church, here's why this matters. That company where I went and I was making Excel and PowerPoint, I can remember about 2 months into that, there was this moment. Now, new in career, there's this moment. I'm in the office. I'm there with a mid-level manager. If you're familiar, he was a principal, right? And then above him was kind of high-level manager. He was a partner. And the principal's sitting there dictating to the partner, hey, here's what we're going to do in this instance. He's a good guy. His name was John. I was newer to it. John was a micromanager. John loved to do work with his face over my shoulder, trying to see everything I was doing. Hated it. Hated it. I've always had authority issues. That's my sin, right? Hated it. And we're in this meeting, and I, in my brilliance, decide to say, okay, this is a time where I say no, and I'm going to say no right in front of him. And so we go to this meeting, and the principal, John, he's putting forward this plan, and I'm sure it was fine. But I can remember thinking, I'm not doing that. And I can remember saying, I don't think that's what we should do. And there were multiple points where I discredited, invalidated, and inappropriately challenged authority. Can you challenge authority? Absolutely. Parents, train your children to challenge authority, but to challenge it well. Because not all authority is good authority. In that moment, I was absolutely out of line. The principal in that moment, he just shut me down. He just looked at me and said, hey, we're done. You're done. This is what we're going to do. I'm just asking you to say yes. Dude, I remember it was like I got scolded as a 6-year-old. I'm asking you to say yes, which in that moment, emotionally, what he was saying is submit. I said yes. And I left. And then I realized my sin. And I came back. I said, hey, will you forgive me? Why? Because man, in that moment, my job was to honor him. I was responsible for the relationship. It was my actions, my attitude, and I'd missed it. It had been my sin. And here's what I tell you. John himself, through that conversation, he was a Christian. I got to share my faith, and I got to remind him how I'd missed it. Employees, both our actions and our attitudes matter. What you do and how you do it and the why you do it, it matters. You're not honoring a boss. You're honoring a king. Y'all tracking? Okay, let's look at the last verse. Last verse, verse 9. Masters, so employers, hear this, man. Every employee is about to be like, amen. Do the same to them. You hear that? Do the same to them. So what are masters called to be? Respectful. They're called to lead you in a way of trembling, care to the details, doing it well to honor you. They're called to do it with sincerity, without duplicity. They're called to do it in service to God first, knowing, hey, he's the real one that, as this text will show, will help them give an account. Not by way of eye service do they change when you're around them, or is there sincerity? Not as people pleasers, not so the boss can give them the pat on the back, but because, and this is you, if you own the business, if you lead the business, you have tremendous influence. If you lead the family, you have tremendous influence. Your action and your attitude matters. And is it done with goodwill towards all? Masters, do the same to them. And stop your threatening, knowing that he who is both their master, the true master of the employees, as well as the master of the employers. He's in heaven, and there's no partiality with him. In the economy of God, God does not care if you're the CEO of the Fortune 500 or if you sweep the floors. He doesn't care. He calls both to faithfulness. So how you treat people matters. As employers, our actions and our attitudes matter to God. The action, he's calling you to treat them the way you would have them treat you. Employers, you have more influence. You set the tone, you set the standard. People don't, you ever heard this phrase? People don't quit jobs, they quit bosses. If you're a Christian employer and you have high turnover, what I'm telling you is that's likely symptomatic of your leadership. I'm not saying there aren't industries that inherently have high turnover rates. But what I'm saying is your leadership a blessing to them? That's what you're called. Those with power have always been meant to steward the influence toward those without. Your actions matter and your attitude. I love this. God even goes after don't threaten. Like, does your leadership involve threats? Leadership 101, the weakest form of bringing about change is through positional leadership. What does that mean? Folks doing what you say because they have to. It's the idea of, hey, we're going to do it just because I said so. I'm not saying there's never a place for that statement after a long discussion or whatever. But what I'm saying is if that's your leadership style, that's very weak leadership. Leaders lead through influence. How do you lead with influence? You treat them the way God treats you. And you don't threaten. You don't threaten. Why? Because you too have a boss. You too have a master that will one day ask you, will give you good in response to your good. For, how did you care for those that I put in your care? Work is not inherently evil. Work took place before sin was ever even involved in the world. Work will take place in the future, new heavens and new earth, and every time it will be under great leadership. So employers, are you leading in that way now? This past week, somebody sent me a list of companies here in New Braunfels. It came through the local magazine, the Herald, and it was the finalists or the best of New Braunfels, And they've whittled it down to the finalists where they go through every type of company. I'm talking accounting all the way to like vape smoking shops. I'm serious. Pet grooming, right? Everything. It was a very holistic offering of companies. And what they do is they put it before the community. They say, hey, what do you think provides the best service, the best care? Here was one of the most amazing things that I saw. 6 of the companies on that list, and if your company's on that list, bless you. 6 of the companies on that list are members of this body. 6 of them. And those are people who in that, they have serious influence of ownership, leadership, directional oversight. Christians, we should flood that list. Even beyond this body, a friend shared with me, no, I know the names of at least 20 other people who don't go to church here but are Christians, and their companies are on it too. Christian businesses, Christian organizations should create amazing products. Why? Because we're serving it for a bigger purpose. It's a representation of a bigger God. But also, those places, they should be amazing environments to work. To where that whole political vibe, the political feeling, the jockeying for positions, that doesn't exist, man. You know where that starts? It starts with leadership. You want to change a culture to reflect servant leadership, loving them as God has loved you. It starts with the employer. So leaders, win every form of the best in New Braunfels. I hope you win all of that. I hope you get nominated to New Braunfels top 40 under 40 because of the excellence to which you do your service. But here's what I'm really asking for. The attitude behind that, may that reflect in every way an honest sincerity to do it for the King. Not for the magazine. Not for the New Braunfels 40 under 40. But because the King loves you. To recap, as employees, both our actions and our attitudes, they matter to God. As employers, both our actions and our attitudes matter to God. And now remember, this is true wherever you are in an organizational hierarchy, whether you oversee the family business or, and this means a lot to me, you oversee the family. Your actions and your attitudes, they matter. So there's an idea that I want to leave you guys with. This is the main theme of what I believe is this whole text, a philosophy, if you will, or a theology of work, all throughout Scripture. Your work, what you do, your vocation. Work is worship. Work is worship. The manner in which you put your hand to the plow to bring forth good, to create good products, good spreadsheets, good balanced budgets, good teaching tests, star tests at the end of the year. If you're the pet groomer that's being voted for in New Braunfels list, the way you groom pets, your work is worship, rendering good service, right, with a good heart. Because so much the way we worship, it's for God. And so that's where we as a people, we must be marked by that. So tomorrow when you go to work, tomorrow when you start to think about it in a different way, prayerfully, think, God has sent me here for such a time as this, to put my hand to where my work is an expression of who I worship. A lot of times people think about worship in a workplace as simply evangelism, inviting somebody to church, being kind, not gossiping. And hear me say, those are true things. But it is also, if you own the car washing company, give the best car wash. Work, it's worship. I had a friend that modeled this for me this past year. He was working for a Fortune 500 company right down there in San Antonio. He'd elevated himself beyond kind of mid-level management, but again, it's a huge company, so he'd done well there, right? He led a team of database engineers. I was trying to ask him what that is, and he's like, you won't be able to figure it out, right? So very technical was the word he used, right? And he sets up this team. Now, a lot of times in companies like his, the team that he specifically oversees, it's one of tremendous difficulty. Why? They kind of put out technical fires whenever they come up. And that'd been something this company specifically brought him in to help and to manage. And he'd been doing that for years. And he had been doing it well. There was a person they were going to bring as a divisional leader over his team and then multiple others. They brought in an outside hire. That outside hire, this gal, and I have no doubt that she meant well and intended well. But man, she came and she broke every leadership rule like day one. When the first 2 hours, she'd made significant changes. When the first 2 hours, she had cast blame and thrown him and his team under the bus in front of the head, what was a senior vice president, I think. Right? And here's the way I described it to him. So it's like, so in that moment, right, how'd that make you feel, her throwing you under the bus? And he's like, dude, it wasn't thrown under the bus. She drove over me, backed it up, pulled it forward, backed it up, drove out again. In this division, this section where he'd come and he'd always placed honor in how he worked, all of a sudden, it became the piñata that she set up to tear down. What did that build in him? Serious resentment. What did that build in him? A lack of caring for her. Meetings, he became dismissive. He got quiet. The way he responded and cared for her, the language he used did not set her up for success. He could see the ways that she was hurting people, even beyond his division. Did he warn her? Nope. Did not care for her. He got connected with some of the members here. He started thinking through that work environment. Some of the members here, they started to challenge him in response to texts like this, the theme of, hey, your work, it's a form of worship, not just your technical expertise, not just the way you oversee and construct data, protect others, but the way you carry yourself, your actions, and your attitudes. And he began to wrestle with it. And you know what he began to see? Regardless of the authority, I've been called to something greater. My work is an expression of my worship. You know what he did, man? He scheduled time to go and sit down with his boss, to where he sat there, and in that moment, and then she, in seemingly what sounded like just new leadership insecurity and coming into a new company, right? She comes, she gets connected, he sits down, and he leads with this: I can't believe you. Will you forgive me? And he asked her forgiveness for all the moments that he emotionally rolled his eyes, for all the moments when she left the room and he was still with colleagues, they talked about her in a disparaging way, for all the moments where he did not have sincerity, he did not have respect, he did not have care. And he began to explain, that is on me. He asked her forgiveness for all the moments where he could have helped set her up for success, but instead, he allowed her to move towards the oncoming train of poor workplace performance. You know what happened? They had a phenomenal relationship after that. I'm not saying it was all easy. I'm not saying everything went well, but there was respect. Now that gal, even through that moment, she went on to being let go by the company. But here's what she knew of that man. That man respected the workplace because he was serving something greater than himself. Regardless of the position of authority, he knew in his heart, work is worship, not just in the products that I create, but in the attitude in which I do it with. Church, if we live and we work this way, how might this change this city? If I came and brought this same dedication and attention to as I come to prepare you in God's people, you'd like that, wouldn't you? Yeah. Here's what I'm telling you. God wants you to go do that with everybody. It doesn't matter your position. It doesn't matter your placement, whether you own the company or you lead the family. He wants that care in every way. Let me pray we do that, and then we'll get out of here. Father, I thank you that your word says, whatever you do, work heartily, rendering service, good service with an attitude, knowing, hey, we come and we serve you. That's a gift, God. I thank you that you have changed in my heart the view of authority is a blessing rather than authority is a curse. Would you help us to go from here to where we have the heart of, hey, our work is worship. What we do matters both in action and in attitude. To where tomorrow as we go to sit down at whatever our office is, the spreadsheets we have, the computer, the little one that did not sleep as long as we desperately wanted, that we would say, God, I do this out of love and honor to you. May we be people filled with worship. I need your help to do that. We need your help to do that. Would you help us to go forth that way now? We love you, and we ask this in your son's name. Amen. You guys go, and y'all have a great week of worship.